Hi, this is the show that answers the questions that expats, nomads, and full-time travelers living across the globe ask themselves every day. These insights and secrets are shared when we interview experts and authors from across the globe. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries. It is my pleasure today to be interviewing Polly Collingridge. Now, Polly is currently in the UK, and welcome today, Polly.
Thank you, Doreen. Lovely to be here.
Polly was born and mostly brought up in London. However, she has also lived in Mexico, so we have that in common. She's lived in Mexico, Ireland, Italy, Costa Rica, Scotland, and the USA. We've been on a similar tour sometimes. And she speaks some Spanish and some Italian. She has a degree in cross-cultural psychology and is a certified facilitator of cultural intelligence, which is nowadays known with the abbreviation CQ. She's currently an account manager at the Cultural Intelligence Centre in the UK. She's responsible for consulting with new and existing clients from both the public and the private sectors. And so the thread that runs throughout Polly's resume is really that her passion for sharing the stories and the idea that knit us together and that facilitate connections between people. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I am so honored and privileged that you are here today to speak to our audience and to myself, because I have much to learn about cultural intelligence. And so I'm here to be the student today. Welcome, Polly.
Thank you, Doreen. And honestly, I'm honored to be here too. So I'm sure we can learn a lot from each other. And it's funny to think, yes, that Mexico-Scotland connection.
Yeah. And the US and Italy.
Oh, yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
So welcome. So tell us a little bit, how did you land into the intercultural field to start with? What was it that that propelled you into this very interesting slice of life?
I think really it's probably the fact that I did spend a lot of time abroad as a young child. I can't call myself a TCK because I never lived anywhere for that long. The longest I lived anywhere was 6 months. And that was because my father was a film designer. And so he would he would go off on location for maybe a few months and sometimes up to 6 months. And when I was young enough, myself, my sister, my mum, we used to just go with him. So I had this really lovely opportunity to be exposed to other cultures, other languages, whilst at the same time retaining a kind of home base in London to go back to. So didn't have to go through that sort of some of the challenges that TCKs have to. So I think that was probably the catalyst really for me being interested in other languages and cultures. My dad spoke Spanish, and so I was always very proud that he was able to speak to the locals or order in a restaurant, and I aspired to be able to do the same one day. And then I studied Spanish and Italian at university, which then meant, of course, that I spent time in those countries as a result. And then later in my 20s, I decided I wanted to go and spend some more time in Central America, and I worked in San Jose in Costa Rica again for around 6 months. But the Italy experience was interesting because I had an Italian boyfriend for a few years, so for that period of my life I was quite immersed in Italian culture.
Yes.
Was going back and forth.
Yeah, there is nothing like real life to help us learn about culture, is there? There's nothing that replaces the reality. All the AI and the visuals, etc., just don't land the same way as that visceral experience that you had, especially as a child, because it's almost like you had internationalism installed into your little brain as you were growing up. So you were so fortunate. I had a sort of similar experience, not exactly with travel, but with exposure to other cultures. And so that's a wonderful story. And it makes perfect sense now that you're working for the Cultural Intelligence Centre in the UK. So can you tell us?
No, absolutely.
Can you tell us a wee bit more about what is cultural intelligence, please?
Yeah, so cultural intelligence is the ability to get on with people who are different from you. So essentially, it's the ability to work alongside and relate effectively to people from a different cultural background to your own. And that could mean a different national culture. And in the case of your listeners, that's probably the first kind of culture that they're thinking about. But culture is a complex thing, and we're all part of many cultures at the same time, really, in the sense that not all British people are the same, not all Mexican people are the same. So culture can also mean your race and ethnicity, your gender, your generation, even the departmental culture. Let's say we're talking about two people working for the same company, but one from marketing and one from IT. They operate in different cultures as well. So culture in that sense, in the Cultural Intelligence Center sense, can be quite broad.
That is very broad. I was speaking to someone recently who was talking about cultures inside a company between buildings. So they had people in different buildings, and the different buildings had different departments and different thinking. And so it's very all-encompassing, isn't it? Because every one of us is an unrepeatable person. Can you please tell me, what does the Cultural Intelligence Centre in the UK do? What do you do there?
So we offer training and consulting to a range of different companies in cultural intelligence. So people come to us with a variety of different challenges. It might be related to global teams not working together effectively. Sometimes it might be related to supporting a DEI initiative. In fact, we do a lot of work with the NHS, which brings in all of that because they have an enormous international, racially diverse workforce, and increasingly so. And so they've found our programs really helpful. So that tends to be our main focus, both the international and the DEI, but we can support with staff engagement and talking to people about how, once they've recruited in a more diverse group of people, how do they make those people feel included and like they can work together effectively. But actually, one thing I should say that will be of definite interest to your listeners is that CQ originated from the world of global mobility, because our CEO, Lynn Van Dyne, who was heavily involved in the original research around cultural intelligence. She came to it through working in HR, working within global mobility, based in Singapore for a company that was recruiting a lot of American expats to work in Singapore. And she was really intrigued to see that some of them adapted so well and some of them didn't, and was just very interested to find out more around why some people didn't get on well and just were always homesick and just wanted to, get food sent over from the States or whatever. And it turned out that CQ, cultural intelligence, was that differentiator, the ability to adapt or not.
And so CQ is now sort of a system that has been described and has been measured and has been researched. And so there's some science behind this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the original cultural intelligence framework originated out of research that came out of the Y2K bug. I don't know if you remember that thing that everyone was terrified that they're going to fall out of the sky when the clock turned midnight. And it turned out that in the run up to the year 2000, there were lots of international teams of bright minds working together to try and solve this problem. And some of the original researchers realized that, that CQ was the differentiator between the groups of people who managed to work well together and those who didn't. So it's now been, CQ has been researched independently around the world. I think there have been more than over 150 or so peer-reviewed papers around the world, and its sort of academic validity as a framework has been proven. So there's tons of research out there that backs up the CQ scale and its assessment that we use.
So there's a scale and an assessment that we can use. And I'm sure there's probably more than one. Is that right?
There's one main assessment that people can
Okay.
take. It takes around 15 minutes, and you measure your current level of cultural intelligence, as well as you get a sense of your preferences on 10 cultural values. Yeah, I can tell you if you want, if you're interested, I can tell you a bit more about the framework and the 4 capabilities that make up cultural intelligence, because when we were talking earlier, you said that people often talk about cultural intelligence, but are a little bit unclear exactly what it is and how it might be different to cultural awareness or
Yes, exactly.
cultural
So,
competence, or, you know.
well, there's a few things I'd like to ask. Number one, I'd like to ask on behalf of the listeners, is there a place where people can go to take this assessment? Are the general public able to take this assessment if they have that interest and that drive?
Absolutely, they can. We do have a store which you can find through our website where you can take an assessment. But anyone listening to this, perhaps if we give my details at the end, they'd be welcome to drop me a line and I can get in touch with them and
We
send
will.
them the link to take an assessment. I'd be happy to do that.
That would be wonderful. Yes, and we will put all of any and all links that you share, we'll be happy to include in the show notes so that when your episode is released, then everybody can find those resources. Thank you. So tell me, yes, you mentioned that there was a framework. Can you tell us the 4 components of the framework?
Sure. So cultural intelligence is made up of 4 main capabilities. First of all, your drive, which is all about your motivation. Do you actually want to relate effectively across cultures? Are you excited about the possibility of getting on well with people from other cultures? Because the truth is, if you're not, you probably won't. Like that's the beginning of it all. You need to want to do it. And then there's the knowledge part. So you've got drive and then you've got knowledge. And knowledge is really what I would think most people think of as cultural awareness. It's about the research piece of how is my culture similar and different to another culture. So if you're living in Mexico, how does your culture differ to the national culture? But also one doesn't want to stereotype. And as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, every country is made up of multiple different sorts of people, which is why the assessment is an individual set of preferences. So our cultural values measure that we include in our assessment is around your personal cultural values, which may or may not be the same as somebody from the same national culture as you. You may have a lot in common, but they may not be identical.
Yes, I have bumped into that, even being Scottish, living in America for a bit.
Yeah, of course.
That was a huge difference, a huge
Absolutely.
difference. And
definitely talk a lot about that because I've noticed so many differences between British and American cultural values.
Yeah.
So just to recap back to the framework, we've got the drive and the knowledge, and then the third capability is strategy. So once you're raring to go and once you've done your research, what do you do with it then? So you need to be able to plan ahead and think about some meeting that you might be having or a presentation that you might be giving or whatever it is, an interview, whatever, even just a conversation with a new friend. How might you want to adapt your behavior, knowing what you know? And then the final piece is action, which is the adaptation piece, the all-important behavior change part. How are you going to change the things that you say, the words that you say? Maybe it's an idiom that you won't use because they won't understand it. Maybe it's the tone of voice that you use, or maybe it's a nonverbal change. Maybe you're going to use fewer gestures or more gestures. Maybe you'll attempt to be more animated or less so. You're going to try and meet in the middle somewhere to relate more effectively to someone.
So it's drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. And I think that as I'm an expat living overseas, although not across the ocean, living in Mexico, I think the drive and the knowledge, if I just apply this to myself as a rookie in this field, is pretty straightforward. And as a third chapter expat in terms of aging in life, to go choose to live in another chapter, I think really demonstrates a drive.
For
maybe,
sure, for
maybe,
sure.
maybe a little bit crazy too.
No, I think it shows. I think it shows that you are probably quite confident in. You certainly would have. I wouldn't be surprised if you came out with a very high level
Yeah.
of drive if you took your assessment. But it's
Yeah.
very interesting. It's also important to also state that when you take the assessment, it's a snapshot of how you're feeling in that moment. So if
Yeah.
you took it at another time, so I was imagining people who might take it when they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, perhaps having just moved somewhere, they might find that their drive is lower than it might typically be on average, because if
Yeah.
they take it in one of those sort of dip moments, they might struggle. But that's
Sure.
just how they're feeling then. It doesn't
Sure.
necessarily mean that they are always going to be less motivated. And yeah, it's very much something that you can develop as a skill over time, cultural intelligence. So
Yes.
it's not a fixed thing by any
Well,
stretch.
I was thinking about the action and the adaptation part of it. And, I think about that living in Mexico, in a Mexican house, looking out at the street. We have mostly people who come to work on our street. It's very quiet. There's only like 4 or 5 houses on this side, and there's only entrances to 3 or 4 houses on the other side. So it's very, very private. It's very quiet. I am left wondering on many days about why is this happening and who is that and why is this? Because so that adaptation, I think, requires time and really requires a lot of focus and a lot of wondering. I think it's wondering and wandering. Because we're sort of wandering around feeling very sometimes overwhelmed and a bit ditzy with just because you're living in another culture. And I've learned to tolerate that state of being, but not everyone is aware that they're in that state of being, number one, and what to do about it, number two. So, what would you recommend to someone who frequently finds themselves a bit overwhelmed with the subject of cultural intelligence, but you're supposed to be doing something, there's an impulse for an action, but you're not quite sure what to do? What would be your recipe?
I suppose just to keep it simple, don't try and do too many things at once, and maybe to just try and have like a coffee with somebody, one person who is from the native culture, or from a different culture to you, if you're living in a very international sort of expat community.
Yes. Get
And
outside the bubble.
yeah, get outside the bubble, and just this would be to try and increase your drive, I suppose, to just try and find some points of connection with that person, because you might well be surprised. It might feel like you have nothing in common, but if I've been in the position of being a training spouse with kids at school in another country, and I found it easier to make connections with the other mothers because you immediately had something in common. And of course, there were many. It was easy. I was in California. They spoke my language. It wasn't maybe nearly as difficult as other people could find in another situation. But
Yeah.
I think the main thing, almost before anything else, just sort of have a coffee and be open-minded and try and find points of connection. And if you do find points of connection with somebody, to try and connect on those on a regular basis and use that as a way of getting inside another culture. And I think a lot of people working in the intercultural field are familiar with this idea of it's always a journey, and it's about knowing yourself first, which is why the assessment is important, because it gives you an idea of where you're at and what you're feeling. And then to just keep your mind as open as possible. And it is incredibly difficult when you're feeling homesick and culture shock and all the rest of it. But keeping your mind as open as possible, and just remembering that there's always another way of doing something. Your way is just one way, and it may feel really bad and weird now, but
you will adapt, or you might adapt. Yes, yes. So can you tell me, how is this type of intelligence different to IQ? And of course, we've been talking for a long time about emotional intelligence. Is emotional intelligence related at all to cultural intelligence?
I think emotional intelligence is incredibly important, and we've been talking about it for a reason. I think that it's definitely something that we all need. But the thing is that you can be highly emotionally intelligent and yet not be very culturally intelligent. So it's not easy to be emotionally intelligent if you are in another country necessarily, because you might not be able to understand and read correctly the emotions of people from another culture to you. So,
Yes.
if emotional intelligence is about understanding and managing your own emotions and also perceiving and understanding and adapting accordingly to the emotions of others, you're not necessarily going to be able to do that abroad if you are faced with people who express their feelings differently to the way you're used to. Perhaps people are
Yes.
way more emotionally expressive or
Yes.
inexpressive than you're used to. Perhaps something even as simple as eye contact. In some countries, as you know, it's a sign of respect and being honest, and in others sort of the opposite. It's almost a sign of disrespect. So you might then have an emotional reaction based on your interpretation of
Sure.
a gesture that you think is portraying a certain emotion, but then not actually get that right. And so all of the research shows that cultural intelligence sort of picks up where emotional intelligence leaves off and just allows you to be emotionally intelligent in kind of culturally diverse contexts.
Situations. That's a very
Yeah.
good explanation. So where emotional intelligence leaves off, then cultural intelligence, of course, adds on to that because it broadens your experience. Thank you. That's a great explanation. Do you believe that everybody needs cultural intelligence?
I really do. I mean, we were talking before, I think we started recording about the sort of polarization, the state of the world as it is today. It's increasingly diverse and we're increasingly intolerant, it seems, of each other's of different points of view. And so I do think everyone needs it. I think particularly any expats out there, anyone living abroad for whatever reason, whether they're there for work or they're there sort of coming along for the
Yes.
ride or whatever it is, we all need to interact with people. I think that is especially important if you're outside of your home culture. But even if you are living in your home culture, there is so much diversity. I mean, even within your family, thinking about generational diversity, to your kids, how they might talk to their grandparents, they're actually being culturally intelligent when they adapt. How kids sort of have one language for their friends and one for their parents, and that's them actually not realizing it, not calling it that, but being
Sure.
culturally intelligent because they're adapting how they're speaking in order to fit in.
And that's very curious because right now we have about 4 or 5 different generations in the workforce.
Absolutely.
I was reading an article that the people who are going back to work more than anyone in the US right now are 75-year-olds.
Wow, really? That's amazing.
Yes. And so when you think you have, 75-year-olds trying to get back into the workforce, and then you have all the way down to Generation Z in the workforce, that's a lot of communities. And each of those, from what I understand, from what you've said, is each of those probably has their own language, their own shortcuts, their own shorthand.
Yeah, their
Where
own values, their
code.
own kind of, their own understanding of what's the right way to do something.
Yeah,
What's
yeah.
the best way to approach something. It varies dramatically. So yeah, absolutely. I think generational diversity is something to really think about, and it's probably going to be it's only going to become more of an issue.
Yes. Well, earlier, you had shared with me the book by David Livermore on the subject of digital diverse and divided. And I think that would apply also to the generational gap. And
You're right. So this is Dave Livermore, who was one of the founders of the Cultural Intelligence Center. He's recently published a book called Digital Diverse and Divided, which really just shows how cultural intelligence can be applied in all sorts of contexts beyond just that international one, to help us navigate, let's say, difficult intergenerational conversations, whether it be differences of opinion within one family, say, about religion, or I don't know, COVID-19 vaccinations, or just thinking of some of the hot topics out there that can really divide people. Back in the UK, up until recently, it was about Brexit or not Brexit. Now nobody wants to talk about it anymore. It's done now. But yeah, that was for a time
Yes.
something that divided people a lot.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, it's
Well, this is very interesting. So in Digital Diverse and Divided, I'm expecting that if I read this book, I would learn a lot about cultural intelligence and actually how to bridge the generational gap, because I noticed that the behavior of other generations, I'm looking at my daughter and thinking about how digitally motivated they are, and how they use, and how I did not grow up with the internet, and I struggled and I fought against it, but it won.
yeah.
And so, but I constantly feel like I'm going to a different culture when I get online.
Yeah, I think so. And I sometimes realize that I occasionally realize that my kids, who are both, I've got teenagers, and they just, they're on Snapchat or TikTok or whatever it is. And there's just another way. They have a shorthand use of emojis, a use of sort of shortened acronyms for words and things that I
Yes.
don't understand. And they're
Yes.
quite sophisticated. And I think
Yes.
that they dumb it down for my level. If they text me, they use the simple basic emojis. A
Yes.
laughing
Yes.
face is actually, a laughing face,
Yes.
but they tend to use with their friends. I've seen they use the crying face, like streaming tears emoji face,
Yes.
for something being hysterically funny.
I noticed that too, and I noticed that my daughter does dumb it down for me, and take
Yeah.
time, and she will use like whole words in a text and
Yeah,
explain things to me.
I know. I know. My son even capitalizes things and puts full stops. I don't think they bother to do that with each other, but I think
No.
he knows I kind of find that comforting.
And so, if we are interested in studying cultural intelligence, and you feel like we all need it, because I know I definitely do, but I also put myself in a situation where I need to use it more than many. By living overseas and by making that choice, we honestly put ourselves right in the bullseye, right in the target for having to be more culturally intelligent. And that is, I think, a consequence that many nomads perhaps are not aware of when you first leave, because it's all a great romantic adventure that you're going on. And you don't realize that there actually is mental and emotional work that has to be done to process the journey.
Yeah, and I think when I went to the US, that was probably the most impactful of my intercultural experiences, in the sense that it was the longest of them all. I was there for 3 years, and I went with my family, with my kids, so it involved that uprooting
Yes,
of a home, which before
yes,
I guess I was either too young, or it was just, I saw it as a sort of relatively short-lived adventure. But this was different. This was a slightly open-ended moving of everyone and everything. And I wish I had known then about cultural intelligence, because despite the similarities that we've talked about between the US and the UK, as we've said, there are also considerable differences. And I think it would have been, somehow you don't expect them. Sometimes when the cultures are very similar, you sort of imagine it's going to be relatively plain sailing. But there's an idiom that, I found myself constantly undone by idioms which are different sometimes between the US and the UK. And so that was one funny thing that I realized I sometimes didn't quite understand what people were talking about, and realized they probably hadn't quite understood what I was trying to say. But yeah, there are definitely areas. I think if I'd had made maybe a more concerted effort with some of my CQ knowledge, I would have been better prepared when I was found myself enrolling my kids in their school and interacting with the parents, trying to make friends, that whole social life side, which was so
yes,
important, because whilst we were there for my husband's job, I was very much all about, as I bet many of your listeners are, sort of operation make a life for us, make the kids feel settled and all of that.
yeah,
And I think it would have been very helpful to have done, first of all, a little bit more research or reflecting on myself and how I might find that America more challenging. For example, I'm quite an indirect communicator, and most of the people I met in the US were more direct and more straightforward. and had less problems tying themselves in knots, saying what they wanted to say, like as I did. And so that was a learning. I guess I knew that a bit about myself, but it brought it to the forefront. Sorry, what were you going to say?
And that's a sort of a drip, drip, drip. I am married to an American. Well, he's actually 50% British, but grew up more in the American system and the military system and was a TCK around the world. But I just had another 2x4 awakening the other day because he is constantly requesting that I be more direct. And as a Scot, I'm still indirect. My mother, if you asked my mother, when she was alive, would you like a cup of tea? I don't mind would be the answer.
That probably meant yes.
It's yes, so indirect. And I find myself still, I have that, it's inbred in me. It was my first culture. It's my heart culture. It's the culture I try and be really aware of functioning from my Scottish self as much as I can. And it just hit me the other day, the direct and the indirectness of our cultures. And we've been married for 40 years. This is a repeat lesson. This is not a recent thing. And so it can be very subtle. And because we are who we are, this is settled into our beingness. And that in cultural intelligence is where that lives. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think actually, just listening to you talking, I realized that I did end up adjusting very happily to my life in the States. And actually, I think that I probably needed to be more culturally intelligent when I returned back to the UK, because that reverse culture shock piece that everyone talks about genuinely is really so much, or at least it was for me, so much worse than the original kind of adjustment period of getting used to a new life. And I had become so accustomed to what then now to me seemed a refreshingly direct approach of the US, so that when I got back to London, I found all of the very overly polite texts between the London mothers asking each other essentially for major favors, but tying themselves in knots, doing it in a way so it seemed polite, just a big old waste of time. Because I was at that point used to California, used to kind of the American kind of more time is money thing. And I was like, just say it, like, and then all of this sort of like signing off with a kiss with someone you don't really know that well just suddenly seemed, it was fascinating because I thought when I first moved to the States, I thought it seemed a bit, I don't know, just a bit direct and a bit brusque and a bit rude. And then by the time I went back to the UK, all of those niceties seemed a little over the top and hypocritical. And it was really interesting because I then got to see my own culture as an outsider for a short time.
Oh, can I quote you on that in the book? That was very well stated, very well said. Thank you. And it did occur to me earlier that sometime we should address repatriation. And a separate topic.
It could be a whole other conversation because I found that a very fascinating and actually very difficult experience. But ultimately, of course, as always, you adapt to that too. But it was challenging.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's very challenging to finish the book on the subject. So how do I get better at it? What are some practical tips for our audience and our listeners today about how can we develop this innate skill, and how can we fall in love with the idea of cultural intelligence?
Well, I mean, I'm going to hark back to the assessment I'm talking about, because I think it is really important to get a sense of where you are in your kind of cultural intelligence journey. And then you'll get to see quite clearly which are your strongest or weakest capabilities. And let's say, I think in my case, it was strategy, because I'm not brilliant at planning. I tend to be a bit more going with the gut, launching myself in. So I took from that, if we want to have just one takeaway, even, this sort of work is hard and it takes time and everyone wants immediate results, don't they?
Yes,
so I think if you take one takeaway from your assessment, choose one area to either it could be a strength that you're like, oh, I'm good at that, so I'm going to really just remember that and do more of that thing. And for me, it was okay, I need to just plan a bit more. So if I am going to have a meeting with somebody who's plainly from a different culture to me, I'm just going to do a bit of thinking about who I am and how that, and my understanding of what they might be. But then you've also got to, if you're working on strategy, you've also got to check your assumptions, because of course people surprise you all the time, and they might not be exactly a stereotypical idea of, let's say, a German person. So be able and alive to that, and be sort of checking your assumptions while talking to them. It's really just about starting, just being open-minded and aware and noticing. And of course you're going to get it wrong all the time, because we always do, right? But just sort of opening your brain to the idea that not everyone sees the world the way you see it. And to just being curious. I think that's the main thing.
Well, being curious and realizing that not everyone sees the world the way we see the world. If we could all develop those two things, we would understand the great wisdom that Polly has just delivered here. And thank you very much for this wonderful conversation on the subject of cultural intelligence. So please, where can our audience find you in future? And I will include your links on the show notes, but where would you like them to find you?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn. They can also email me at polly.collingridge@culturalq.co.uk. And if they want to find out more about cultural intelligence generally, they can look at our website. Actually, we have two websites, culturalq.co.uk and .com, for those who are based stateside or globally, whichever their preference is. So there's lots of information there. One thing also I was going to say was, on our website, in our blog section, I've written a blog about CQ and global mobility specifically, and there's also the recorded interview between myself and Lynn Van Dyne, who is our CEO and our sort of chief researcher that I was talking about earlier.
Yes.
And so people might want to know more about her, the research side of things. And I had a conversation with her and another one of our advanced certified facilitators who uses CQ a lot in her training and coaching with expats around the world. So people might be interested. And if you have anyone listening who is an intercultural trainer or coach, we also offer certification programs for people who might want to incorporate CQ into their training, into their work.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you very much for this, Polly. And we look forward to keeping track of you. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Please follow and watch out for Polly and the Cultural Intelligence Centre in the UK. And please, if you would like to share, review, or comment on this episode, we invite interaction, because we have invited you today to our kitchen table, and we hope that you'll come back. So it's sayonara, hasta luego. Thank you very much, Polly.
Thank you so much, Doreen.